So, hey, first of all, I'm going to talk about Node, and this is PolyConf. So, I obviously made sure that this presentation applies to people who are not just Node developers. I'm going to tell you a few things about Node.js itself. I'm going to help you choose if Node.js is the good technology to use for your needs, and also I'm going to do everything I can to make your project succeed when you choose Node. And I'm going to do all of that in 25 minutes, so how cool is that? Starting out with reference to Zeph. So you met Zeph like 2 hours ago, probably, and he told you not to use Node. Well, not exactly. He gave you an example of what happened when a project used an immature technology. And it was with Node 0.4, which I never saw. I'm actually pretty experienced in Node.js, I think, but I started with 0.8, and then the first node I ever run in production was 0.10, which is the same version Walmart has been running in production when they handled the first Black Friday on their Node.js app. So it seems okay for production after that. They found some interesting memory leaks that only manifest themselves in situations where you have millions of users an hour and stuff like that. And currently, Node.js LTS is 4.0, so it, as you can see, it evolved a bit. And current stable is 6.0, released a few months ago. Yeah, we're on 4.0, where I'm deploying Node to production. So, first things first, what should you use Node for? There are some practical use cases for it. There are things that you shouldn't do with Node. If you're building a translation layer or a middleware that is exposing an API, or if you're exposing a feature through WebSockets, these are the things you probably could build with Node.js and succeed with that. There is also the whole genre of integrations between two systems. If you don't want to modify them and their APIs are incompatible, or they are both expecting to be getting requests, no callbacks required, then you're building an integration, and Node should be good for that. Also, if you have a microservice architecture, well, then you can put any technology in there, and you can mix and match technologies for whatever reasons you have. Also, Node.js, which I didn't mention here, but Node.js is very commonly used for front-end tooling. So if you're creating a build system for some front-end technology, Node.js is your choice. Obviously, for HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, best tools are already written in JavaScript. And if you want to run them to build your application, Node is your choice. So that's the brief summary of what I'm pretty certain everyone can use Node and succeed with. There's obviously a lot of different things you will take into account when choosing your technology, but I hope you can succeed with Node when it's needed. And a short summary of what it actually does. So I guess most of you know by now that JavaScript is single-threaded, and Node is single-threaded. So everything in Node is asynchronous. There's a thing called event loop, and when you're running some of your code and it reaches a place where you're doing a request outside or getting some data from DB or doing some input-output in general, then your code execution pauses and some other piece of code is executed while this code that's been running is waiting for a response. So that's how you have sort of concurrency running on a single thread. That's it about basics. So why even bother writing JavaScript when there's so many beautiful languages out there? So first of all, you all know JavaScript already. If you're doing anything on the web, you know JavaScript. If you're building a team of people who need to quickly write or prototype something, you need to put one experienced JavaScripter in there, and anyone else can join them on the team and write JavaScript applications. And if you don't believe me, I can tell you that's exactly what happened to me at Ignite, where I currently work. So for over a year, I was the only JavaScript native speaker on the team, and everything seems to work. Also, JavaScript is everywhere, not just on the web. So if you want to learn some language and you didn't learn JavaScript yet, I do recommend it, because then you will be able to hack some hardware without getting involved with C, for example, because Node's available on hardware as well. Actually, JavaScript is a pretty decent language if you know what to avoid. So there's plenty of resources for what to avoid in JavaScript. I recommend those if you're new to the language. So you're writing an app. Let's assume it's a web app. So first you get some libraries, and then you define your app using Express. You let it respond to some request, and then all you need to do is start it. This is the simplest NodeJS app you can imagine. It uses good old JavaScript without the ES6 stuff yet. Very simple example. And starting off with such an example, you can build a simple API. You can build a simple app available through HTTP. And then you put it on production. So first of all, you have to run your app on a server. You can obviously just type, SSH there, start a screen, and type node space app.js return. It's working for a while. And then when you get an uncaught exception or something bad happens, your app is down and you have to SSH again and do that again. That's silly. So there is very old tools called Forever and Cluster. They've been with Node since almost the beginning. And they let you run Node processes, make sure that the process is up, make sure that the processes are load balanced. And as you remember from Zef's presentation, it's actually complicated to get it right. So these tools are available to everyone for years now. So why use them directly? There's probably someone who used them before and did a better job than you would trying it the first time. So there we go. There's tools for this, obviously. There's PM2. PM2 is a fairly new but already pretty stable tool for running Node.js on production. I don't recommend using their deployment scripts yet. Just a tip for you. Write your own deployment infrastructure, because deployment is immature with PM2. But actually the runner, the process manager, is very good. It helps you with no downtime redeploys. It manages your applications, and it gives you a comfortable interface. So you have a process manager. You can go to your server and ask, this is an actual recording of a session I did with SSH. So you can list things. These are apps running on our staging server. Yeah, the list is longer now. Anyway, you can list them. You can reset apps manually if you need to just quickly reset and see what happens. You can add them, remove them, whatever. It's very comfortable to use, and it's very comfortable to script with something else. So since you're already on your server, running in production, first things first, you have to monitor your infrastructure. So you need to monitor your server resources, obviously, and you need to check if your app is running and responding to HTTP. And one thing I want to tell you, no matter which language you're using, no matter which technology you're using, if you're doing monitoring in production, take what your company already has. Don't choose any new fancy tools, because old monitoring that looks horrible and that's uncomfortable to use, but there's people looking at it 24/7, is always better than your new great monitoring tool that you're looking at in between merge requests. So just remember that. Old monitoring with people is better than any new fancy tool that no one's looking at. So we're in production, and we have basic monitoring. And before we can do anything else, there's some good practices that are worth talking about. So first of all, your app should be stateless. It's good for any application, but in Node, your app should be stateless, and if you're doing something else, you're asking for trouble. So don't store any client information in between requests because it's a burden, it's not helpful. Try to make your app scale horizontally without any complication. So you just spawn multiple processes on multiple servers, load balance those, and it just works. And for temporary data like sessions, you can use Redis. This is also a technology that Zef mentioned. But if you don't use Redis for persistence, just for storing temporary data, it's going to be perfect, and you don't have to worry about scaling Redis for quite a while. One machine with Redis is going to scale well for quite a while before you have to think about it. And you will have to fix a lot of things about your application before Redis becomes a bottleneck. And since we're in Node, you have to make sure every operation is asynchronous. If you do something synchronously, you're going to block Node for a while, and during that time, no one else is going to be accepted in. So all the requests are going to wait. That's why you need to be able to handle asynchronicity. Yeah, it's a complicated word. And I recommend promises. Promises are easy to teach people, and when you get hold of promises, you can work with them for quite a while without any hiccups. And promises are not exactly about building asynchronous flows. This is not where promises are best for. What they are awesome for is error handling. Error handling with promises compared to callbacks, it's a totally different story. And make sure that you're doing everything asynchronously. So out of you ever using JavaScript, how many of you know that you can parse JSON asynchronously? Okay. That's as much as on a JavaScript conference a few months ago. So yeah, you can. There's JSON parsers that work asynchronously, and if you give them a megabyte of JSON, they won't stop your application for a second. They will do that in small chunks. And how many of you who know that they exist actually use them every time? Yeah, me too. So there are cases where you can go around parsing JSON synchronously when you know these are small chunks. But be aware that if JSON is your input, you should do that asynchronously. Okay, and that's going to be controversial. So yes, I'm talking about JavaScript, and now I'm telling you to enforce types. There's a lot of ways you can enforce types, but it's very useful for important objects that are central to your application's flow. So if you have a certain data that comes from database, and with the same unchanged format, it has to go through a lot of steps and then be changed or recreated, or it gets created based on input, you should enforce that the object has a certain structure. So if you just blindly write everything with pure JavaScript objects without any type checking, you will know about your errors when users send you screenshots with undefined somewhere in them. That's not good. So you can use TypeScript. TypeScript adds types to JavaScript. It's a Microsoft technology. It's very stable, established, and it works well. But you have to dive in and start using types everywhere. So then you get type errors as you compile. And if you don't like types everywhere, you can actually find a middle ground. So you can get warnings as you test your app or as you start running your app. Or with external tools. One of them is Facebook's Flow. It's a very new tool, but it gets a lot of publicity. So it's very promising. You should try it and see if it works for you. And if you're not ready for that, or you have some legacy JavaScript code, you can just take a small library that ensures the shape of your objects and sprinkle it in important places, which is what I did some time ago, and I wrote strongly typed, full disclosure, that's my brainchild, which is very simple to use and has tests. I didn't use anything else that was already out there on NPM because they either weren't simple to use or didn't have tests. That's NPM. Okay, so when you're in Node, you have a lot of dependencies and you should manage them. It's not like you just NPM install and trust that everything's fine. So first of all, if you're not sure about some of your dependencies, if they're not going to break semantic versioning or something, you can always use npm shrinkwrap. It's a very helpful tool, and you should run it once on your repository before you go to production. Then there is more maintenance with updating versions, but you know that your app will never crash because someone released something that didn't work. Then, if you're installing some unmaintained code that someone just popped into npm and forgot about it, consider not doing that and writing those 3 lines that you're getting rid of instead. And finally, use Node Security Project or Require Safe if you have money for that. These are tools that will let you know if any of your dependencies in current versions has known security issues. So you just run the script and you get those red pieces of text saying that there's a vulnerability in this version and you need to upgrade one of your dependencies. That's a very useful tool, and Node Security Project is aiming at checking everything in NPM that people actually use. So there's a long road ahead of them, but they're doing their best. And now we're in production. So with all the best practices in place, hopefully, you're in production with basic monitoring. What's next? First of all, you probably have some logs, because everyone likes to sprinkle a log here and there. You're putting them in a file or storing them in some fancy tool for searching in the future. There is one thing I need to tell you. If you're expecting more than one user in your application, and I hope you are, you have to put IDs on your requests because Node is asynchronous. So when there's a request coming in and you have logs sprinkled across the whole asynchronous process of handling it, you need to know which of the logs are actually coming from which requests coming in, right? And this is a screenshot of some logs that we have. And those colorful numbers are random numbers assigned to incoming requests. So as you can see, they're not exactly in order with colors, and these are just info logs. If I gave you all the debug or trace logs that we use for seeing what's actually happening with a request in a special mode, then there's a lot of them. And filtering through them would be impossible if we didn't have means to associate them with an incoming request. So this is very important. Then the basic slide about log levels. I'm not even sure if I need to tell you all that anymore. So there's different log levels. Info is the middle one, where you put basic information about what actually happened in your app and was expected. Then warnings can be used for errors that you expected to happen in some place. Error and fatal are pretty obvious. And then there's debug and trace, which you need to decide what you want to use them for. But I tend to use debug for short information about what's happening in case you want to research how your app is doing in production. And trace is the level at which you put in logs enough information to be able to manually reproduce on your local server or in staging. And about logs, the interesting part when running in production is that you need to make sure you can change the log level without restarting the application. That's pretty important because whenever a problem occurs and you want to switch to debug level, when you reset the app, you will not reproduce it anymore in most cases. And sanitize your logs. So if you're logging sensitive data like user tokens or user names or anything, make sure that no sensitive information is going to logs. You have to encrypt it somewhere or hash it, because if you're actually writing passwords into the DB and you hash them with very complicated hash functions, and then you put those passwords plain text in the logs, what's the point? Okay, and now the what to monitor part. So Node obviously handles HTTP, so you need to know about your HTTP traffic. I'm going to skip that because everyone writing servers already knows what to monitor about the HTTP traffic. But there's one thing specific to Node, and you need to monitor loop blocks. So you either have a tool like Keymetrics or New Relic or App Dynamics, and there's a few more, I suppose, where they monitor the node process itself. Or you can use simple tools like Blocked, which was written in some like ages ago by TJ Holwaychuk. And it's 15 lines of code that will let you know when your app is blocked for too long, so that you can eliminate places where you do synchronous things. And for Node, it's pretty important to measure your memory increase, because what you might not know is that your process will crash at around 1.5 gigabytes of RAM. That's because for JavaScript's garbage collector, it's unreasonable to have this many live objects. So this is a bad case for JavaScript garbage collector when you have to garbage collect very few of over a gigabyte of objects, so you have a hard limit on memory. So make sure you monitor that and make sure you don't have memory leaks, which is the next slide. Debugging memory leaks. It's a very old topic, and there's established techniques to do that. There is V8 Profiler. You can use if you're running on a developer machine or in staging. And there is a tutorial I linked to. It's from 5 years ago. So a very old tutorial, and it still works fine. It's a very simple thing to do. You just make heap dumps in production and then look at them, compare them to find memory leaks. It's not always easy to find them, but it's always worth doing. Last but not least, a maintenance endpoint. So if your app is listening to HTTP and sending out some data, you probably need to have some tools to communicate with that app when you're on the server trying to debug it, switching log levels and stuff. So you can just open another port, but just on localhost, so that you can go to a server and manage this particular node process with your app. So a maintenance endpoint would have obviously switching log levels without restarting. It could generate your heap dumps. It could contain a health check endpoint for monitoring. It could also run some scripts that you put in for diagnostics. And it can return statistics if you don't have a big system for aggregating your app stats. You can just add a tiny endpoint that will return them. That's a good way to start with that. So unless you're using something like a big paid platform that collects your HTTP and other statistics for you, obviously, but that tends to be the thing that you sprinkle in after you've run in production for quite a while. Okay, so things I didn't put in that presentation because I had to fit in half an hour is getting and using heap dumps. It's actually not that hard. All you need to know is you shouldn't require the heap dump module as your app is starting. You should only require it whenever you need to make a heap dump. It's complicated, it's documented in the README, so I defer to that. So I didn't tell you about global error handling, which is very comfortable for HTTP servers. Feature toggles are a good thing if you're running in production. There is a lot of security things we could talk about, not just around Node, but around HTTP servers in general. There are a few things specific to Node as well, especially if you want to not be open to a simple denial of service attacks. Then no downtime redeploys are a very interesting topic. So everything that is claiming it's giving you no downtime redeploys is actually wrong, because if a user is uploading a file to your server and you do a no downtime redeploy, you will stop the upload anyway. So a real no downtime redeploy is a bit more complicated, and you have to take it into account in your load balancer and configure the relationship between load balancer and your nodes. And a few links about debugging in production. This is a serious issue that will affect you once you have decent amounts of users, enough to crash your application from time to time. And these things are how you look into your app's performance and crash results. Okay. I'm planning to do workshops on this, so if 25 minutes is not enough for you, you can subscribe to this sort of newsletter. I'm not going to send you any unsolicited emails. I'm just going to inform you that I finally managed to prepare the workshop. So if you're interested in workshops on NodeJS or JavaScript in general, subscribe to that. And well, thank you for listening. I hope you have questions that I'm capable of answering. Thank you very much.
Great presentation.
I have one question regarding login. You suggested using a random ID, and my question is that correlation ID would be passed as a function parameter, or have you developed any other way to pass it to places that you would like to log?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So the basic idea is to just keep on passing this to every function and then sprinkling logs with that ID. But what we actually ended up doing is that whenever we get a request, we create an instance of a very simple logger module. And we, when the instance is created, the number gets put in there, so that whenever you use this logger, it's going to add this number automatically, so you don't have to think about it. And the only thing you have to think about it is to put this logger in a scope for your application that is going to be available in that request. So we end up putting it in a field on request. So it's request variable dot request logger or something. And you can access it from most places where you're dealing with request, and you can pass it on to any other functions. Also, promises, some implementations of promises, let you set contexts so that you can put something on the good old this variable, where your request logger is going to be available throughout the whole promise chain. I hope that's enough for a start. Next, you just build your architecture in a way that your request context, so the logger and other information like monitoring, is always available to you with the right context of a request.
Hi, good presentation, like always, I'd say. I'd like to ask, because I'm doing a little bit now the backend development in Elixir, Koa, or Happy in production, actually. But I don't feel the community as good as probably you. So my question is where the community is going, because we are able to say what's in which direction the community of Ruby is going, where the front end is going, but where is the Node backend community heading? Because the TJ Hollow just switched to Go, and this is a little bit nice.
Yeah, I think I get the context of your question. So TJ switched to Go at node 0.12, I suppose, and he was fed up with instability of low-level things, and he wanted a different language. So this was a single case. After that, a lot of interesting things happened in the community because there was a big, let's call it an issue to be polite, where Node got forked, IOJS happened, IOJS got developed for a while, and then with a huge effort, everything was joined back together to be called NodeJS again, but instead of being a product of a company called Joyent, it's now a foundation. So foundation now has members coming from different companies, including huge companies like Intel that didn't seem to have anything to do with Node. But thanks to that, Node is going into directions that you wouldn't expect before that. So that's how Node gets to work with hardware and sort of embedded hardware, the more powerful ones. There is the community is growing, obviously, in size, and there's interesting things happening. So I think the community is at the level where it's reaching the mature level, sort of. With the recent issues with NPM, where NPM decided that you won't be able to remove old versions of your modules that you published, because that upset a lot of people who had issues with left pad being gone. Not a lot of you, luckily. So now such issues are not possible. With Node Security Project, this is another case where we can see this is getting mature. So we have people doing security reviews of everything that is popular on NPM. I'm very optimistic about the community after Node.js got merged back again from IOJS and Joyent's ownership. And at this point, I was certain that Node.js is here to stay. So when the split happened, I thought, okay, it's time to look for alternatives. Okay. Yeah, you can see those trends mostly on GitHub and with more popular NPM modules. So functional style is obviously getting more popular everywhere with JavaScript. And in terms of style and good practices, I guess front-end and back-end with JavaScript are moving sort of in the same direction. So ES6 is also getting more popular in Node. There are people who transpile, but you can use most of ES6 with Node out of the box now. You don't have imports with the new ES6 module syntax, but this is coming in pretty soon. So if you want to watch trends, I recommend looking at big changes like major version switches of popular Node.js libraries, and that's the good place to look for trends. And well, internet will tell you. If you start looking for examples of Node.js and make sure that they are not from 2012, you will know what people are doing now.